For many European cultural communities, there are yet other centers. The breakdown of hierarchy and the loss of center are things you will either be convinced of already, or I fear I can never convince you. Nevertheless, permit me a frivolous example, but it's frivolous precisely because of the breakdown that I'm talking about. Let me take the case of opera. In the United States, opera enjoyed a high cultural status at the beginning of the 20th century. It could be said to represent high art to American culture at large. That status began to break down in the United States by the time of the Great Depression. Opera at that time could seem to be a symbol of the upper class, and perhaps its lack of connection with the economic and social problems of the working class. Hence, it was available for parody and became the subject of the famous Marx Brothers comedy, A Night at the Opera, in 1935. But while opera was available for parody, it was still believed that opera was a part of high culture. So I can get that video on the left to play.
Joy the infant mind.
The main characters are opera singers, and their talents are acknowledged. The hierarchy of culture still existed in 1935. The situation was already very different 20 years later in 1957 for this cartoon, What's Opera, Doc? Something important has happened in those 20 years. The culture's conviction in high art is fading rapidly, so that opera is depicted without any serious dimension. It is just silly. This is actually an interesting case because Bugs Bunny himself refers back to the Marx Brothers. Bugs is Groucho. By now, that is to say in the 90s and the 2000s, the change has gone much further. Popular culture itself can become honored, reinscribed as important cultural icons. So in 1992, What's Opera, Doc? Became the first cartoon short to be deemed, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the United States Library of Congress, and thus was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. And what is the status of opera today? In the United States, symphonies and opera companies struggle. Opera and classical music in general have become simply another musical choice for a particular community of listeners. And is this not true of all the arts and entertainment forms today? There is simply no universal agreement about what constitutes culture anymore. No center. Perhaps music is the earliest and best example of the breakdown of cultural boundaries that I'm talking about. Here are two recent pages of the music section of the Arts and Leisure section of the New York Times. The New York Times, the so-called paper of record in the United States, the very concept has the lingering notion of the elite, is perhaps the best place for coverage of classical music today, and indeed opera. New York, after all, is something of the classical musical capital of the United States. But diversity is now the key to the Times music coverage. So there's an article on one page on the jazz great Miles Davis, on the other, an opera by Lully. Advertisements on the Davis page are for the New York Philharmonic, but also there's an American Express series including Duran Duran and Barry Manilow. Although the Times is probably much less likely to have an article on the music of Britney Spears, contributors will write about more, quote, serious rock music. I've belabored a point that you would perhaps already concede, the breakdown of the hierarchy and the growing status of popular culture. So let's return to visual art and art history. And let's go back for a moment to the time in the 20th century, which was a key moment in the revaluation of high and popular art culture. I mean the assault on modernist art beginning in the 1960s. For the fate of elite art and the fate of modernism are clearly and closely linked. Let me now appeal to two theorists who are associated with the phrase the end of art, the American Otto Danto and the German Hans Belting. What Danto seems to have meant by the end of art was not the end of artistic production, of course, but the end of a feature of art associated with high modernism, the master narrative. The narrative structures of traditional representational art and then of modernist art have eroded in at least the sense that they have no longer an active role to play in the production of contemporary art. Art today is produced in an art world unstructured by any master narrative at all. There was a story to explain the progression of art in modernism, a direction if not a teleology, but it is disintegrated. In some sense, for Danto, this happened because art at the end of High Modernism, famously with Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes, had reached a kind of conclusion by posing the question, what is art? What can art be? What can't be art? This was, as for Danto, the end of art. Art became philosophy. Hans Belting agrees with Danto that the end of art is the end of a narrative. In this case, both by artists and art historians. The end of a linear conception of art as a history of styles. He too is not concerned that art itself will come to an end. Historians replace the one mandatory art history of style with several or even many art histories side by side, much as today's artistic styles. Artists, for their part, took leave of a linear conception of history that had forced them to carry art into the future while waging war against its old form. What narrative are Belting and Danto talking about? Well, we know who is most commonly thought of as the spokesman for high modernist narrative, fairly or not, Clement Greenberg, with this notion that abstract expressionism contributed to a new phase in the history of style by exploring the flatness as the essential quality of painting. But I want to remind you of another aspect of Greenberg's narrative, the function and status of elite art as opposed to popular culture. Greenberg's antipathy to popular culture, which he called kitsch, is evident in his early influential essay, The Avant-Garde in Kitsch. Simultaneously with the entrance of the avant-garde, a second new cultural phenomenon appeared in the industrial West, that thing to which the Germans give the wonderful name of kitsch. Popular commercial art and literature, with their chromotypes, magazine covers, illustrations, ads, slick and pulp fiction, comics, tin pan alley music, tap dancing, Hollywood movies, etc., etc. It's all kitsch. In any case, to quote Belting one more time, everyone knows that art has with an implied capital A, has meanwhile fragmented into a spectrum of resistant phenomena that are accepted as art long before we were able to define them. But what exactly does everyone know? What did happen to art when the capital A disappeared? Well, lots of things. One thing is that the modernist assumptions did not really die out at all in the 1960s. These assumptions shattered into fragments, as Belting suggested, and the fragments found their way, confusedly, into popular culture, and some of them are still with us today. I would like to call this phenomenon popular modernism, the appropriation of modernist assumptions and practices by popular cultural practitioners and writers. We can see it beginning already in the 1960s in a variety of ways. Let me choose just one of my favorites, a superstar popular figure who was ideally positioned to appropriate aspects of the avant-garde modernists. John Lennon. Lennon's music with the Beatles became increasingly ambitious and allowed enthusiasts to claim that rock music was becoming art, but it was especially his brand of political social activism that borrowed from the avant-garde. Interestingly, Marshall McLuhan once interviewed Lennon for the CBC, when both Lennon and Yoko Ono were in Canada promoting this anti-war poster. McLuhan, can you tell me, I just wonder how the war is over, the wording, the whole thing, what happens? Lennon, I think the basic idea of the poster event was Yoko's. She used to do things like that in the avant-garde circle, Poster was sort of media, whatever. Lennon's reference here to Yoko Ono is significant. Yoko Ono, of course, was an important figure in the avant-garde, sometimes called the neo-avant-garde of the 60s, associated with Fluxus. And Fluxus certainly saw itself as the heir to the political avant-garde of Dada. In collaboration with her, Lennon became the projection of the political avant-garde into the popular realm. In the interview, McLuhan himself gives no indication what he thinks, but it would be nice to think that he approves of Lennon, it seems to me, as carrying out in practice a project that McLuhan himself foresees in theory, preparing us for the shock of electronic media. And indeed, McLuhan himself was an important figure in the popularization of modernism, because he promoted a mediatized version of the feature of modernist aesthetics that I just mentioned, essentialism. While Greenberg was just concerned about the medium of painting, McLuhan wanted to generalize this essentialism to media and their impacts. So his famous analyses of print, radio, television, in terms of their essential technological characteristics. And McLuhan gets us back, finally, you will say, to the digital era, because he has been interpreted as providing the theory of digital media as well as television. And in the process, he has brought with him high modernist assumptions about essence and linear progressive narrative to digital media. In 1993, as we know, Wired magazine named McLuhan its patron saint, and his influence within the digital media community and media studies has risen since. This community is attracted precisely by the technological determinism that Raymond Williams in cultural studies rejected in the 1970s. Another indication of the way in which modernism is still operating in popular quarters is in the appropriation of the vocabulary of the art. Even ironically, among some of the very people who are promoting digital technologies. They want to have it both ways in a sense. They contend that new media constitutes a revolution, yet the revolution means that new media forms can join the old in being special. In other words, they can be art too. Indeed, they can be that most traditional of 20th century categories, avant-garde art. For example, video games. Video games are a massively popular new media digital form. Yet they are also, it seems, a form of art to which the term avant-garde is applied with abandon. An article in Wired magazine in March of 2007, for example, was entitled Latest French Avant-Garde Games. The article explained that the French government had decided to support the French game industry with tax breaks and to induct 3 game designers into the Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, and this somehow constituted France's recognition of games as avant-garde. Many video game writers want to appropriate the category of art for this popular form. This quotation from a well-known writer and maker of games, Ralph Koster, shows what I mean. The closer we get to understanding the basic building blocks of games, the things that players and creators alike manipulate in interacting with the medium, the more likely we are to achieve the heights of art. But why even expect that games would be art? Because many, like Koster, still assume that there is a cultural hierarchy and he wants games to join that hierarchy. But then Koster gets specific. He borrows precisely the notion of medium, of advancing the medium, from modernism. For games to really develop as a medium, they need to further develop the ludines, not just the dressing. By and large, however, the industry has spent its time improving the dressing, but the systems themselves tend to see fairly little innovation. Again, the point is to find the essential qualities, what Koster calls ludines, of the medium of games, and to push those forward. Whether this ever was, in fact, the coherent narrative of high modernism, it certainly is how Greenberg and others have been understood. It's not just game designers. Lots of popular media producers from film and popular music also adopt the rhetoric of art and want to claim a place in the hierarchy that has already disintegrated. We can see that in this debate between film critic Roger Ebert and the author and game enthusiast Clive Barker, as introduced by this quotation from Ebert. This is Ebert talking or writing. A year or so ago, I rashly wrote that video games could not be art. That inspired a firestorm among gamers who wrote me countless messages explaining why I was wrong and urging me to play their favorite games. Of course, I was asking for it. Anything can be art, even a can of Campbell's soup. What I should have said is that games could not be high art, as I understand it. There follows then in this article a debate about whether games have the essential qualities of art. The point is